Hey, welcome back. Thanks for joining Tony and I for the conclusion of our 20 for 20 series. Today, we're sort of just speculating and having a conversation about the thing that's on everybody's minds. Is there going to be college football in the year 2020? And Tony, I think Alabama kind of made some headlines concerning that topic today.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of optimism today, as Alabama kind of softly opens up. You know, Alabama's president, Stuart Bell, he told CBS 42 that he's optimistic about starting the football season as scheduled and also bringing all of Alabama's 38,000 students onto campus, so that's really positive. Let's pull up the quote here. It says, as we look forward to accomplishing another great fall semester, welcoming back students and welcoming back our sports teams to be able to have competition. Those are our plans, and it's a high bar, and anticipates that we will be able to meet that. So, look, that's optimistic. But it's really positive. Alabama's classes are supposed to start on August 19th, so there is some time. But as Stuart Bell or President Bell said, that is an ambitious time frame. But it's also an optimistic one, and it's also should provide a little bit of positivity moving forward that possibly we could have this done.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that there are going to be fans as well, or at least that's the
Yeah,
goal
that's
is
the
to have
plan.
fans.
Yeah, the plan is that there'll be fans, and it'll be somewhat normal, according to what he said to CBS 42, and I think that's what everybody wanted to hear, right? Um, it's going to be hard. It's definitely some challenges in it. I know the NCAA also came out with some guidelines. Do you want to kind of refresh us on those as well?
Yeah, so the NCAA basically came up with their own sort of phase one, two, and three that's based off of the national policy that the White House has introduced, and at its core principle, it's states have to meet these certain sort of standards. Basically, hospitals can't be overcrowded. Hospitals have to be able to manage the current load of COVID patients in addition to other patients. You need to be able to sanitize areas to protect people. Any students that have any underlying conditions that make them at risk. In the first phase, I think phase one and phase two have to avoid contact with their peers. So it's basically just a sort of a soft reopening of sports, just like we're sort of seeing that right now going on in Alabama and other states, sort of a soft reopening of businesses. Obviously, some restaurants are reopening and you can go out, but there's maybe only 6 tables instead of like 12 or 20. So it's sort of like that. And then the way it progresses is, you do phase one for 2 weeks, and then you do phase two, and then you do phase three, assuming that you're meeting the criteria that once you do phase one, cases aren't spiking in your region. Otherwise, you sort of reset back to your previous phase.
So
Um,
the problem here's the issue that I see. I mean, and you can tell me what you think about this, is what happens if Alabama's going through phase one, and then they're moving on to phase two, but maybe Georgia can't move on to phase two, and they're behind. Like, do you see that could maybe cause some troubles here if we're trying to start a football season? The SEC is just more than one state, and every one of these institutions has to follow these phases, and they might not all be on the same phase at the same time.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially you think about Alabama's opener against USC.
Yeah.
California is by far one of the hardest hit states. It's, I mean, the lifestyle and the social distancing practices that are in place in California seem completely different from what we're experiencing here at Alabama. Obviously, it's a different level of intensity.
It's
And
really going to be interesting to see, with all the differences in a schedule, how you're going to be able to put together a full schedule and ensure that it gets played.
mm,
Um, you know, I, not even looking at, I said Georgia, but you mentioned SEC. I mean, you mentioned USC. Look, like, what happens if not enough Pac-12 teams can play? Or what
mm.
happens if, for that sake, what happens if not enough SEC teams can play? Same in every conference. Does South does Southern California just play 4 games, or
Mm.
or it's really kind of there's a lot of question marks here, and it's real interesting to see, like how this is going to play out. It's a good first step, but it is kind of, there's a lot of problems that could ensue.
Yeah, and that's something you see in what the NCAA came out with today. It talks about specific regions, um, meaning that some regions will get to phase one before others, and some will get to phase two, and then phase three is where you start to experience something resembling normalcy. Well, it's entirely possible to think that, Alabama and perhaps most of the schools in the SEC will progress through the phases quicker than some of the schools up north where they've experienced more. It's also possible that, you know, maybe there is a school or a state like Georgia, perhaps, where, Atlanta was harder hit, obviously a lot more international and national travel going through Atlanta. Maybe, Georgia remains stuck in one of the lower phases and can't get up to the point it needs to be to compete or travel. And then you have all sorts of, it's not just the NCAA, you have governors that impose their own restrictions. You have federal guidelines that say certain states are okay to travel to a certain amount or to gather in groups of 50, and some states say you can't gather in groups of 10. So, yeah, I think college football could be sort of entering a regional phase, at least for the next year.
And one of the biggest keys that we haven't talked about either is I think all these institutions, in the SEC they'll all have to have their campuses back, their players back. None of this is going to happen. And I think one of the biggest things that Stuart Bell said, President Bell, was that, he plans on having all the students back, because I don't ever see a world in which, students are still taking classes online and they just send the football players in to go play football. I mean, these guys are student athletes. That's one of the things that the NCAA mentioned first and foremost, is that these athletes are students first. And so if it's not, the safe guidelines, there's not going to be a case of where they're just going to play football. The biggest thing for me is that all these campuses return and that you are able to have in-person classes, because without that, I just really don't see it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if the NCAA can't figure out how to let us play a video game, how to make that okay, it's hard to imagine that the NCAA is going to figure out a way to respond in real time to the issue of having people on campus or having sports if people can't be on campus. I mean, it completely undercuts the core argument the NCAA has made for the last decade plus, is that these guys are just students that are also athletes and not athletes first. And you can't play football or basketball or anything else if you're also telling kids, but don't come to campus because it's not safe.
And here's another thing too with these phases, right? I mean, who's to say that, in the middle of a season, let's say, let's be optimistic and everything starts on time with all the teams. Who's to say that one of these campuses doesn't experience an outbreak or, a reversal and a spike, and they have to stop or go back to phase one or phase two, or, what does that do for the rest of the other schools? Do you halt all of the SEC play? I mean, obviously you can't just have this team, sit out while other teams are playing games. Gets real interesting. And then another thing, obviously, is what happens if just one of these SEC players contracts coronavirus? I mean, look at that. It's kind of what happened in the NBA, and it shut down. I guess, what do you think would happen then?
Yeah, and the nightmare scenario is, absolutely what you said, at least in my opinion. Delaying the season 2 weeks or 2 months, that's one thing. But starting on time or delaying even a month and then starting, but getting 2-3 weeks into the season and then a player on Alabama, LSU, Florida, Georgia, really any team, if they contract the virus, you're going to have to quarantine that entire team. You can't just say, Tennessee, play without your running back. That's fine. You have to assume that everyone's been exposed. So suddenly Tennessee can't play football for 2 weeks. Well, what about the team they just played last week? Are they quarantined too? Suddenly that's it. You've got at least 2 teams potentially in the SEC that can't play football for 2 weeks, maybe more. And then that, exactly. Like, how do you just keep the conference schedule going? And can you imagine what it would be like if somehow we make it to November and then all of a sudden one of the teams at the top of the division races that's trying to clinch the spot to Atlanta, whether that's in the East or the West, what if suddenly they're quarantined? What do you do with the season then? And I think that's just a logistical nightmare. I don't know how you handle that, a season that's interrupted.
Yeah, and then I mean, obviously Alabama and Southern California play first, but look about out of conference games where you're different parts of the regions in the middle of the season. What happens if I have to pick an out of conference game here, but what happens if Florida State had somebody? What happens if something in the ACC happened and it involved a team that played an ACC team that played an SEC team, and then it kind of circles and cycles down into the rest of the conference, and it's just there's so much intermixing. I think that's the real theme that we're getting at here. Is there's so much intermixing that it could really become a nightmare situation fast, because it's not even like the NBA where there's a set amount of teams. I mean, we're talking about 120 teams, and there's a lot of intermixing of within conferences. I mean, what happens if a school from one of these Georgia State, you mentioned Atlanta, what happens if they have a case and Alabama played them? Now, everybody that Alabama's played is, does that affect the whole Pac-12 because Alabama played USC and USC played another Pac-12 team? That's kind of what I'm getting at too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's we're recording this on May 1st, so obviously a lot could change in the next few days, weeks, months. But, I think that's the big thing. It's, at least where we're at now, it's hard for me to imagine that the season is normal, and it's hard for me to imagine that everyone is playing all of their non-conference opponents. It's a lot easier, at least on May 1st, for me to imagine, let's go conference heavy. Maybe we have an exception for openers. Maybe like the first week you're allowed to play non-conference people. I don't know, or maybe we delay the season, or maybe we cut out the first 2 weeks. It's hard for me to imagine that everyone plays 12 games, and it's the 12 games that are currently on the schedule.
Yeah, that's a big ask. And one idea that I had too is, if you were to cut out non-conference games and start the SEC schedule, I guess in October, you'd be in the same schedule. But even that's kind of challenging in itself, because what does that do to a New Mexico State that needs the money from playing, an Alabama, a team like that, a UT Martin, who's very dependent on that check for playing Alabama, that payout. It's really hard to say, well, you know what, your whole athletic department's going to take a hit this year because, and there's contracts to be made as well. So there's a lot of financial issues that come with it too. But that could be at least a not great, but a solution. Whereas you kind of keep to your region. So play within your region is a lot easier in a school like in a conference like the SEC. Look at the ACC. I mean, you can stay in your conference and still play the whole nation. I mean, it spans up across the whole Eastern Seaboard. So there's no real easy answer to all this, but I guess today was a bit of optimism.
Yeah, and I think optimism has kind of been the theme earlier this week. NASCAR announced that it's coming back, I think, May 17th. We had the NFL draft. It feels like it was maybe 2 weeks ago, but it was really just about a week ago that we had a live sporting event again that we could watch. So decision makers are trying to get back, and they're also trying to find ways we can fill the time while maintaining social distance. But yeah, it's hard to imagine that it's not different. Stuart Bell's comments were very ambitious, and I think it's good to have that mindset going in. But I would imagine that Stuart Bell has also had a number of conversations that weren't so positive behind closed doors, where what do we do if we can't start classes on time or something like that?
I think maybe a better question is, do we have a national champion this year? We might have football. We might not have a national champion. Is some football better than no football too? I mean, there's a real chance that we play this season and it doesn't get finished, but at least we got some college football. In my opinion, that's better than no football.
Yes.
And we'll have to see. I think this is going to be a weird year. It's going to be a year where we're going to have to adapt to new things, and it maybe it teaches us something. I mean, maybe there's stuff we can learn from this year and kind of apply it to next year. But I think this is going to be a real learning year, and just kind of grit through it and kind of
Mhm.
roll with the punches.
You know, yeah, and sort of going off that, it seems possible. I haven't seen this idea necessarily floated around, other than to say, some of it's been thrown out there that maybe conferences, especially the Power Five conferences, they may not be able to agree on a time to start because the SEC may be ready to go in September, and the Big Ten might be ready to go in October, and California might not be ready to go until November, and if a collection of schools feel like they have the ability to play a season out,
They might just
we
go
don't
for it.
yeah we don't know when a second wave might come. If a second wave might come, if you have a window to go, it seems like you should probably take it. And what if we have the SEC play for 8 weeks, and then the Big Ten starts, and then the Pac-12 starts? What if the conferences just end up staggered and we have football from like August through March, but it's just one conference at a time?
Maybe in April we'll have the AP just vote on who's the champion, and now just enrage everyone for.
Yeah. And then it'll be like, there was SEC bias because they hadn't played for 6 months. So they didn't get a fair shot. I mean, yeah, you can imagine all that stuff. But yeah, to go back to sort of what the NCAA mentioned, the things that stood out to me that the NCAA said had to happen before sports can get back to normal is you have to have temperature checks for athletes all the time. That's something that I think we would have freaked out about a year ago. But now it seems like, well, duh, you're going to check everyone's temperature.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't let sick staffers or sick players, for what I understand, like no matter what they're sick with, like if there's a chance that they have the coronavirus, you can't let them come back until a doctor clears them. So that'll cause a controversy at some point. Some team star player.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Mac Jones or Bryce Young or Najee Harris is gonna have just like, a non-coronavirus, sickness, and he's gonna have to miss the game because of some kind of precaution, and that's gonna cause a whole, I'd be interesting to know how many times players play sick. It's not something that you always have to report. So that'd be
Yeah, I
awesome.
mean, I'm sure it happens all the time, and you see in NFL, in practice reports that players are listed out of practice with illness all the time, and then
the basketball team, this past season dealt with multiple illnesses, and players had to miss games, but they were always a game time decision. So yeah, that could be a complication as well.
Yeah, so I think it's tough to imagine that everything's going to be normal this season, but if this is any positive to take away, athletic directors have said, we have to play at some point. We have to have a 2020 season, even if it's in, next spring, which is technically 2021, because they, I mean, ADs have said we can't make ends meet financially unless we play football. There's TV contracts that they have to play to get paid out. I mean, and then you just think of like all the sort of support people and if there are fans, or even if there aren't, you still have to have a certain number of people just to run the stadium on the game day that, those people aren't going to get paid. Just so many financial sort of obligations that are sort of tied up in having a football season. And to a lesser extent, sports like men's basketball and in the SEC baseball for several schools is a revenue driving sport. If you don't have those sports, then the whole athletic department takes a hit. So yeah, it seems like they have to figure out a way to make it work. At least, whether it's 8 games or 10 games or what, it seems like we're going to get football at some point because there's almost no other alternative.
Yeah, for no other reason than they have to. It's the lifeblood of college sports is football. So yeah, for no other reason than they have to, it should happen in some form. It's just going to be really interesting to see how it does, and will we be happy with the final solution?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if the solution will necessarily be ideal, but I think I think I can say on May 1st I'll be happy just with anything. 3 games even, just
yeah,
give me some sort of at least for a couple weeks, give me college football back. Give me something to do, give me something to watch, give me something to debate. But hopefully it's able to come back and it's a relatively normal experience. And this all seems like a distant memory next year, but it's tough to imagine that that'll be the case.
Definitely, yeah.
Anyway, I think this is a good place to stop. A little bit of a depressing note, but again, hopefully when we look back a couple weeks from now, it's all more positive. Thanks for tuning into our 20 for 20 series. And if you missed any of our installments, uh, I would say 18 of the 20, maybe 19 of the 20 are all, still good information, good to consume. There was one or two about the draft that if you go back and look, you can see, well, the draft's over. Our predictions for who goes in the first round maybe not matter, but you can see how Tony and I did.
Yeah.
And you can tell us how wrong we were about some of those guys. But, for the most part, all of these conversations Tony and I have had are going to be good for the next several months, until Alabama returns to practice, whenever that is. And even after Alabama returns to practice, some of these things talk about, we had one a couple days ago, who the captains are going to be at the end of the season. I don't think that's going to change until the season itself starts. So feel free to go back and check those out whenever you have time, and definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel and keep up with us. We're going to continue to put out a lot of recruiting nuggets every Monday through Friday. And we're also going to keep producing content like this on the team as it happens.